Hey there, so video part 2. I'm just going to breeze through the last 10 slides or so about education. We've talked about intelligence, we've talked about how kids learn language, and honestly those are two giant focuses in the school system. But let's just talk about how schooling looks. You guys have been in the system for the last 10 years or whatever, so actually longer because you're in grade 12, not in grade 10. But maybe even longer if you went to pre-K or something like that. So let's just look at what kindergarten looks like. So in Canada, 70% of Canadian homes have both parents working, and so that means that all-day kindergarten is necessary. That was one of the reasons why the province pushed for full-day kindergarten, because so many parents are working that financially it doesn't make sense for us to spend a giant portion of our paycheck on daycare. So because of this, even though kids are in kindergarten all day from like 9 to 3, generally parents need to work longer hours than that, usually 8 hours, so before and after school care is likely a reality. So you have to picture this may or may not have been your reality, but quite often children go to daycare and then go to kindergarten and then come back to daycare. So it's really important that their experience at kindergarten is rich. So child-centered kindergarten is the name of this kind of model, and it's super important for not just cognitive development, but socio-emotional development and physical development. So let's just look at what it looks like, because I'm going to be asking you guys to explain some of this when we do go to Vincent Massey next week. So it looks like instruction based around interest. So this means that what the teacher does from year to year might be vastly different, because different kids will be interested in different things. One of the main parts of this is celebrating and promoting the process of learning rather than grades. So likely children will get descriptive feedback on tasks, lots of like verbal communication because a lot of them can't read, but they won't get like a number or letter grade. They'll just have like progressing well or not progressing well. Also, hopefully we'll see this when we're at Vincent Massey, but the importance of play is huge. We're going to focus in on this on Thursday, but children learn through doing, experimenting, discovering, speaking, listening, namely because this is the way that they would learn naturally in the wild, the little animals, but also they can't read, so they can't access material like that. So they have to access it in different ways. I find that like once kids learn how to read, we start to move away from this idea of doing and experimenting and discovering and reading about things, which may or may not be a good thing. I'm including this slide because a couple of people, I think Gilmore and maybe Coots, and I'm not sure, a couple of people talked about Montessori. Montessori is an approach. It's almost like a private kindergarten or a private preschool, but some teachers take on the ideas of Montessori as a theory and apply them to their kindergarten class. This is where children are given free play, where they will be in a classroom or a space and they'll have complete freedom to choose activities, move from activity to activity, and play as they wish. So they could play at puzzles for 5 minutes and then go over and play in the water table for 10 and then pop over to the reading station for 5 minutes. They don't have to like move in stations. Also, the idea of the teacher as a facilitator rather than like to teach the kids content, the teacher provides experiences for the children to learn on their own. So those are the takeaways from Montessori, and we're also seeing those approaches now in today's education. So let's move into literacy and numeracy, just so you have an idea of some of the benchmarks. We've talked about how environment plays a huge role in school readiness. So a child's home environment does influence language skills, and that in turn influences their readiness for school. So if they have a rich home environment, hopefully they'll have rich language skills, which hopefully will make them like better ready for kindergarten. There's been longitudinal studies that show that the number of letters, like alphabet letters, that children knew in kindergarten correlated with reading achievement in high school. So kids that knew a large amount of letters in kindergarten were more likely to be higher level readers in high school. So the idea of reading to your children and teaching them these things at home or in preschool is huge. And we talked about when we read Boris, I'm going blank, the book about Boris, Boris the Vulture Sulking. It's important to engage kids as you're reading. So if you spent any time in kindergarten classes, the teacher will usually pause, engage the kids in the story, ask them to recognize words, ask them to look at the text, and do activities around reading to stimulate interest. Numeracy is the same idea. It can't just be rote learning, like memorize your numbers 1 through 10. You have to be able to manipulate numbers. This is where children sometimes get left out. If the focus at home is literacy and not numeracy, then they might need to catch up on numeracy at some point in time. So it's important that there's balance, because both literacy and numeracy is tested throughout public school at multiple levels in standardized testing. So continuing on, I mentioned that in middle to late childhood, vocabulary increases as steadily as it does in early childhood. So at 6, the average kid knows about 14,000 words. By 11, so 5 years later, they know about 40,000. So they're still learning tons of words. They're also learning complex grammar if they're being taught it in school or by their parents, and they're also learning about what's inappropriate or appropriate to say. Generally in middle to late childhood, children have learned most of the swear words and learned when to use them and when not to use them. So the last couple bubbles on your sheet, remember you're just kind of like putting the highlights in the circles, I kept them small for a reason, are these last few bubbles. So we're going to talk quickly about poverty because, like we've spoken about with environment, there is a correlation between low income and level of readiness for school. So what that means is that children from poorer families tend to fare worse in their readiness to go to kindergarten. They're also more likely to have cognitive or language delays, and also more likely to repeat a grade, like fail a grade, than peers that are middle or high income. 15% of Canadian children live in poverty, and so this is like a huge issue. That's 1 in 10. So in a classroom of 30, you're going to have like 3 or 4 kids that this affects. Also, one of the things that we want to keep in mind, since we were talking about nutrition earlier in the week, is that children and youth make up a big chunk of people being helped by food banks, 38%, although that same age group only makes up 20% of the population. So kids are in poverty. Kids have limited access to good nutrition, and this is all something we have to think about when we're thinking about education as well. So groups that are at greater risk for being in poverty include children with disabilities, any child who is racialized, so they're a visible minority, Aboriginal, or even new to Canada. Those subgroups are at a greater risk for being in poverty. Since the discussion today went into like homeschooling and unschooling, I wanted to mention these ideas, but we're going to start with private schools because a huge number of Canadian children are in private schools. There are more private schools popping up nowadays, even compared to the last 10 years. In the 90s, there was a study about enrollment, and they looked at public school enrollment, and it was increasing by a small number, 3.2%, but private school enrollment increased by 25%. So that means that a lot more people were being enrolled in private school than in the past, and it's not the same as public school. One of the myths about private schools that I wanted to address is that it's not just for quote-unquote rich kids. families with annual incomes of over $100,000 and families with an annual income of under $50,000 make up the same proportion of the private school population. So what that means is that if a family makes less than $50,000, they are just as likely to be a family in private school as someone from a family with double the income. So what this means is that if families want their children to go to private schools, they will make it work, even if their income isn't super high. They will make sacrifices. They'll work 2 jobs because education is considered like a very important aspect of our society. In regards to homeschooling, over 100,000 kids in Canada are homeschooled, and there are some that are unaccounted for because you don't, like we just spoke about in class, don't have to disclose to the school board that you're homeschooling your children, but it's suggested. And like private schools, parents who homeschool their children need to make sacrifices as well. So they'll either one parent will need to stay home from work or hire a nanny/tutor to watch their children during the day. On top of their normal parenting duties, they need to be able to pick instructional materials for their kids to learn, in addition to seeking out opportunities for their children to learn, like museums, going to like different groups, that kind of stuff. Lastly, kind of what we spoke about today was dealing with the stigma of making that choice for their children and potentially being viewed as a bad parent. But basically, that kind of stigma is like most stereotypes, that people are generally uneducated and don't know enough about it, so they just make rash judgments. There's been studies on students that have been homeschooled, and one of the questions that arose today was, well, like, aren't they socially awkward? And like the studies say that if the parents do a good job at homeschooling and provide opportunities for their children to be around other kids, there is no difference between a homeschooled child and a public school child, but it needs to be done right. So on the last slide, I'm not going to make you read anything. I just want you to watch maybe 5 minutes of this short documentary on unschooling. I want you to see how unschooling is different than homeschooling, because it is a philosophy that is like goes back a long ways. Like, even if you've read Alice in Wonderland, the story basically is about Alice like daydreaming while her sister reads her books, and that's because Alice and her sister didn't go to school and they didn't have a tutor, and that's how they spent their day. They learned on their own. So this idea of unschooling has been around for a long time, but it is coming back in vogue now, with people pulling their kids out of school and not providing curriculum for them and letting them explore things that they're interested in on their own. So I want you to watch the first few minutes. I think it's really interesting, especially with you guys being the last year of grade 12. So the last slide that we're going to talk about is spec ed. So if you're talking about education and children, you can't not talk about special education. A huge portion of children in schools have had testing done and have IEPs, which stands for Individual Education Plan. I've given you a definition of disability. What I want you to know is that it can affect the brain in a lot of different ways. It can affect how you acquire language, so how you or information, so how you pick it up and see it. It can affect how you retain information, so how it stays in your brain. It can affect how you understand language, so how you interpret what you're seeing and how you remember it. It can affect how you organize information, so maybe you mix things up, or that has to do with memory, what happens once you put it in there, and then the use of information. So the use of information is how your brain pulls that information out of storage to be applied to a situation. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that your brain can struggle with learning. Some of the common childhood disabilities are listed here. You've probably heard of them, so take a peek at them and add the highlights to your sheet.